My name is Esperanza. I am 31 years old, and for 15 years I was property. Not a woman, not a soul, property. The same way a mule is property, the same way a plow is property. But on the night of June 23rd, 1716, 14 of the most powerful men in South Carolina stopped being masters. They became something else entirely. They became mine. I had spent a decade and a half learning their language, their habits, their secrets, memorizing every whispered sin that floated down from their oak-paneled dining room while I moved silently through their shadows. They never once considered that the woman refilling their crystal glasses was building a list. 14 names, 14 men, and not a single one of them would ever be the same after that night. If this story already has your heart beating faster, you are not alone. Thousands of people just like you, from the United States, from England, from all across Europe, have watched this and said, I never knew. If you want to keep hearing stories that history tried to bury, please subscribe right now. It costs you nothing, but it means everything to a small family trying to keep these voices alive. Leave a comment below telling me where you are watching from. Are you in Texas, in Florida, in London? Tell me. And if this touched something deep inside you, give it a like. It takes 1 second, and it tells me you believe these stories deserve to be heard. But before I tell you what happened in that kitchen, before I describe the sound of iron chains against cold stone and the heat of a furnace burning hotter than any righteous anger I had ever known, I need you to understand something. What I did was not madness. It was not cruelty. It was 15 years of patience finally finding its moment. There are things I saw inside the walls of Grayfield Mansion that no human being should ever witness and survive with a quiet heart. I survived. And I did not stay quiet. What I'm about to tell you changed everything. For me, for them, and for every soul who ever whispered a prayer in the darkness of a place they were never meant to leave alive. Grayfield Mansion sat at the edge of a Carolina swamp like a throne built on rotting wood. From the outside it was magnificent. White columns, magnolia trees lining the front path, windows that caught the morning light like diamonds. But I lived in the back, always the back. The kitchen was my world, stone floors that sweated in the summer heat, walls stained black from years of grease and smoke, the constant smell of boiling lard and wood ash clinging to my skin no matter how hard I scrubbed. At night, the swamp breathed outside the small window above my sleeping mat, croaking frogs, the distant cry of something dying in the dark water. That sound became my lullaby for 15 years. I learned to love it. It reminded me that even in the deepest darkness, something was always alive. My days began before the sun. I was the first sound in that house. The scrape of iron pots, the crack of firewood splitting, the slow exhale of the furnace waking up like a sleeping giant. I cooked for 14 men who never once looked me in the eyes. I served their plates, filled their glasses, swept their floors, and carried their filth without a single word of acknowledgement. To them I moved like furniture moves, invisibly, silently, always exactly where they needed me to be. I understood English far better than they ever suspected. Every conversation that happened over those polished dining tables, every business deal, every cruelty planned, every name whispered with contempt, I absorbed it all. I stored it carefully, like kindling stored for a fire that hasn't been lit yet. I was patient. I had learned patience the hard way. The wound I carried deepest had a name, Kwame. They called him Boy Tom, like he was less than a person, like a name given at birth meant nothing inside those gates. But to me, Kwame was everything. He had his mother's laugh and his grandfather's eyes, and when he smiled, I could almost forget where we were. Almost. I had watched this boy grow from a frightened child into a young man with a quiet dignity that no chain could touch. And I had made him a silent promise, the kind you make with your whole chest, not just your mouth. I promised him that one day the weight pressing down on both of us would be lifted. I did not yet know what that lifting would cost. I did not yet know that the breaking of my heart would be the very thing that finally set my hands free. It was a Tuesday evening when Edmund Grayfield said the words that ended my patience forever. I was standing 3 feet behind his chair, a crystal decanter of cognac in my hands, invisible as always. The 14 men of the Rice Council were laughing, that particular laugh that powerful men use when they believe no consequence will ever reach them. Grayfield swirled his glass, leaned back in his carved oak chair, and announced, casually, the way a man announces plans for a hunting trip, that he intended to use me as breeding stock before the season's end. Then he paused, took a long sip, and added that Kwame would be sold south to the silver mines before Christmas. The room erupted in approving laughter. The decanter in my hands did not shake. My face did not change, but something inside me, something that had been bending for 15 years, finally, completely broke. That night, under the old cypress tree at the edge of the swamp, I held Kwame's face in my hands and told him the truth. We were not going to run. Running saves 2 bodies and leaves the machine intact, still grinding, still consuming, still swallowing lives whole. I had watched too many people run. I had watched them get dragged back in chains, broken in ways that never fully healed. No. I told Kwame that what I was going to do was different. I was going to reach inside the engine of their power and tear it apart from within. He looked at me with those quiet eyes and asked if I was afraid. I told him the truth. I was terrified, but I was more afraid of doing nothing. And that fear, the fear of silence, was the only fear that had ever truly owned me. The days that followed were the most precise of my life. I moved through Grayfield Mansion with the same invisible efficiency I always had, but now every movement had purpose underneath it. I studied the men's routines with surgical attention, when they drank heaviest, when the house grew quietest, which doors were left unlocked, which servant would look away. I counted the chains in the storage cellar. I tested the furnace temperature in the early mornings when no one watched. I gathered the herbs my grandmother had taught me, the ones she called the great silencers. Roots and bark that brought a sleep so deep it felt like the bottom of a still river. Nobody noticed. Nobody ever notices the woman refilling the glass. And that invisibility, the very weapon they had used to diminish me, was about to become the sharpest blade I had ever held. The first obstacle came 3 days before the night I had chosen. One of the younger servants, a boy named Cato, maybe 16 years old, caught me grinding the herbs behind the smokehouse at midnight. He stood there in the darkness, eyes wide, breath shallow, and I saw the exact moment his mind began calculating whether to speak or stay silent. I did not threaten him. I did not beg. I simply looked at him and asked one question, quietly, in the old language that the masters never bothered to learn. "Do you remember your mother's name?" He blinked. His jaw tightened. Then his eyes filled with something that wasn't quite tears but lived in the same neighborhood. He turned around and walked back to his sleeping mat without a single word. I exhaled slowly. The night swallowed the sound of my grinding, but I understood then that the closer I got, the more edges there would be to navigate, and any one of them could cut me open before I was ready. Alone in the kitchen at 3 a.m, with only the furnace breathing beside me, I allowed myself to feel everything I had been holding back. The fear arrived first, cold and specific, not the vague fear of punishment, but the precise fear of failure. If I moved too soon, too slowly, too loudly, Kwame would pay the price before I could protect him. Then came the grief, deep and old, the grief of 15 years compressed into one sleepless night. I thought about my mother, who had taught me that silence was survival. I thought about my grandmother, who had taught me that survival was not enough. Somewhere between those 2 women, I had built myself. And sitting there on that cold stone floor, sweat on my neck and ash on my hands, I made my peace with what I was about to become. Not a monster, not a saint, something older than both, something that the swamp outside would recognize by name. 2 nights before June 23rd, I discovered that James Rutherford had requested an additional house servant be posted near the main corridor overnight. A new precaution. Apparently, one of the neighboring plantations had reported unrest among the field workers. My entire plan depended on the house being as empty and quiet as a held breath. Now there would be an extra pair of eyes exactly where I needed darkness. I spent the following day rethinking every step, every timing, every sequence. I almost abandoned it entirely. There was one terrible hour just before sunset when I stood at the kitchen window staring at the cypress tree where I had made my promise to Kwame, and I genuinely did not know if I had the strength to continue. Then I heard Rutherford's voice from the dining room, laughing again, always laughing, and the hour passed. The doubt passed with it. I had a new plan by nightfall. It was tighter, it was colder, and it was better. On the morning of June 23rd, the Carolina heat arrived like a physical warning, the kind of thick, pressing heat that makes animals nervous, and skies turn a strange copper color before a storm. 3 of the house dogs refused their food. An old woman who worked the laundry told me quietly that the swamp had gone silent overnight. No frogs, no insects, nothing. She said it meant something was coming. I nodded and handed her a cup of water and said nothing. By midday, I had already mixed the herbs into the cognac decanter, the one reserved exclusively for the council's evening gathering. The mixture was colorless, odorless, and according to everything my grandmother had taught me, would bring a sleep within 40 minutes of consumption that no amount of noise or movement would interrupt. I set the decanter in its usual place on the sideboard and smoothed my apron. Then I went back to the kitchen and began preparing their dinner. My hands did not shake once. By 10 o'clock that night, the mansion had gone quiet in a way I had never heard before. A heavier quiet than sleep, a deeper stillness than night. 14 men sprawled in their chairs, heads lolling, crystal glasses still loosely held in slack fingers. I stood in the doorway of the dining room and looked at them for a long moment. This was the most dangerous point, the moment between intention and action, the place where people who were going to turn back always turned back. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The furnace in the kitchen behind me was roaring at full heat, casting an orange glow down the corridor. I thought about every name on my list. I thought about Kwame asleep in the stable, unaware that tonight his life was going to change direction completely. Then I stepped into the room and I began. And if you think you know what happened next, I promise you, you do not. I had dragged the 3rd man, Sutton, the one who kept the branding iron above his fireplace like a trophy, halfway across the corridor floor when I found it. It slipped from inside his coat, a folded document sealed with the Grayfield crest, and something about the weight of it in my hands made me stop. I should not have stopped. Every second counted, but something older than instinct told me to open it. What I read in that hallway, by the light of the furnace glow, rearranged every truth I thought I understood about my own life. It was a transfer document, dated 3 years prior. It listed names, 12 names of servants who had been sold secretly, outside of any official record, to a network of labor camps along the Gulf Coast. The 3rd name on that list was my mother. She had not died of fever the way they told me. She had been sold. She was alive. Or at least 3 years ago she had been. I sat on that cold stone floor for what felt like an hour but was probably less than 2 minutes, and I let that information move through me like a current through water, reorganizing everything it touched. Every morning I had spent grieving her. Every night I had whispered her name into the dark swamp air like a prayer to someone already gone. And she had been out there, somewhere, breathing, surviving, carrying the same silence I had carried, maybe wondering if I was still alive too. The document also revealed something else, something that connected the dots of 15 years in a single devastating line. The Rice Council had not simply profited from our labor, they had been systematically liquidating human lives, selling people who became inconvenient, erasing them from records, replacing them with new purchases before anyone noticed the absence. I was not an accident of history. I was a planned asset in a machine far larger and colder than one Carolina mansion. And now I was inside its engine, alone with the keys. The document changed everything and nothing. Because now I stood in that corridor holding 2 futures in my hands, and neither one of them was clean. The first path, I could use what I knew to find my mother. I could leave that night, take Kwame, take the document as proof, and disappear into the swamp before any of the 14 men woke from their sleep. There were people in the north, I had heard names, whispered carefully between trusted souls, who could use evidence like this to cause real damage in courts, in newspapers, in places where powerful men feared exposure. The second path was the one I had already chosen, the one the furnace was already burning for, and the terrible truth that I could not escape, sitting there on that floor with ash on my hands and my mother's name on a document pressed against my chest, was that both paths required me to sacrifice something I could not afford to lose. One risked my mother, the other risked my soul, and I had approximately 4 minutes to decide. I chose both. Not because I was brave, because I was desperate, and desperation has a creativity that calm thinking never finds. I secured the document inside my clothing, against my skin, where it would travel with me no matter what happened next. And then I continued what I had started. But the nature of it changed in that moment, shifted from vengeance into something colder and more deliberate. This was no longer about making 14 men feel what they had made others feel, though that was still part of it. This was about dismantling the record of their crimes and replacing it with one they could not erase or lock away. I was not just going to make them suffer that night, I was going to make them confess. Each one in their own hand, on paper, with the furnace roaring beside them as their witness. By the time that night was over, I would have something more powerful than their fear. I would have their signatures. And signatures, unlike screams, survive the morning. What happened in that kitchen in the hours before dawn is something I will describe only once, and I will describe it exactly as it was. Not softer, not harder, but true. One by one, as each man surfaced from the herb sleep into consciousness, they found themselves on the stone floor, iron around their wrists, the furnace heat pressing against their faces like a living thing. I gave each of them the same choice, spoken quietly, without theatrics, without rage. Sign the confession I had prepared, or face the furnace's testimony instead. Sutton wept. Rutherford bargained. 3 others prayed to a God I suspected had stopped listening to them long before that night. Edmund Grayfield, the last one, always the last one, looked at me with something I had never seen in his eyes in 15 years. Not anger, not contempt, recognition. He finally saw me, fully, completely, as a human being capable of exactly this. He signed without another word. And when the last signature dried on the last page, I stood up straight, smoothed my apron, and felt something leave my body that had been living there since I was a child, a heaviness so old I had mistaken it for bone. By the time the first gray light touched the swamp outside, I had done 3 things. I had left 14 signed confessions, names, dates, crimes, locations of the Gulf Coast camps, hidden inside the wall cavity behind the kitchen fireplace, wrapped in oilcloth, addressed to a name I had memorized from a whispered conversation 3 years prior, a free black minister in Charleston who had connections to men who printed words that traveled north. I had taken Kwame from the stable, pressed the document about my mother into his hands, and pointed him toward a route through the swamp that I had been memorizing for 2 years, a path that ended with people who would help him move further north safely, and I had set nothing on fire. That detail surprises people. They always assume I burned it all, but ash is easy to dismiss. Paper, signatures, and living witnesses are considerably harder to make disappear. I walked out of Grayfield Mansion through the kitchen door as the birds began, and I did not look back once. Looking back was for people who were not sure they had done the right thing. They say I was sold to the silver mines. They say I drowned crossing a river somewhere in Georgia. Let the sealed archives say whatever keeps powerful men sleeping at night. What I know is this: the confessions behind that kitchen wall were found within the year by hands that knew exactly what to do with them. 2 members of the Rice Council lost their land holdings before the following harvest season. Rutherford's name disappeared from every commercial record in the Carolina Territory within 18 months. Not because he died, but because the people who controlled those records decided he no longer deserved to exist inside them. I never found my mother. That is the truth I carry heaviest, the weight that did not lift with the rest. But I found something she had always tried to give me. The understanding that survival without resistance is just a slower kind of disappearing. I chose to be found. I chose to matter. And if you are sitting somewhere right now, at whatever age, carrying a weight that the world told you was permanent and immovable, I want you to know that the woman who refilled their glasses, who swept their floors, who they believed was nothing, she was the one who brought the whole thing down, not with fire, with patience, precision, and the absolute refusal to be erased. They thought I was smoke. It turned out I was the one holding the match,